The October rain drummed against the pavements of Mayfair as London's elite hurried between the warm glow of exclusive establishments that lined the prestigious district's streets. Among these bastions of wealth and sophistication stood the Sterling Club, a restaurant so exclusive that its waiting list stretched for months and its clientele read like a who's who of British society. On this particular Tuesday evening, the restaurant was preparing for one of its most important events of the year, a charity dinner in support of underprivileged children, with proceeds going to various youth programs across Manchester and London. The guest list included politicians, business leaders, celebrities and philanthropists, all gathered under the banner of giving back to society's most vulnerable members. It was into this rarefied atmosphere that Tyson Fury approached, his imposing 6'9" frame cutting through the rain-soaked street. He had just finished an intense training session at a nearby gym, and despite having planned to return home to change, a last-minute call from the event organizers had convinced him to come directly. His commitment to the charity was such that he didn't want to risk missing any part of the evening, even if it meant arriving in his workout clothes. Tyson wore a simple grey hooded sweatshirt, black tracksuit bottoms and well-worn training shoes, the uniform of a working athlete rather than a society dinner guest. His hair was still damp from the shower at the gym, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being welcomed wherever he went, based not on his appearance but on his reputation and character. As he approached the ornate entrance of the Sterling Club, with its brass fixtures gleaming under the warm light of gas effect lamps, Tyson noticed the usual array of expensive cars dropping off elegantly dressed passengers. Women in designer gowns and men in bespoke suits emerged from Bentleys and Rolls-Royces, their laughter and conversation creating a buzz of anticipation for the evening ahead. Standing guard at the entrance was Nigel Ashworth, a man in his early 40s who had worked security for high-end establishments across London for nearly 2 decades. Nigel took pride in his role as the guardian of exclusivity, viewing himself as the essential barrier between the deserving elite and the unworthy masses. He wore his authority like armor, and his keen eye for detail had earned him a reputation for maintaining the kind of standards that kept establishments like the Sterling Club at the pinnacle of London society. As Tyson approached the entrance, Nigel's trained gaze immediately assessed the newcomer. What he saw, a large man in athletic wear, clearly not dressed for an upscale evening, triggered every alarm in his professional consciousness. Without hesitation, Nigel stepped forward, positioning himself directly in Tyson's path. "I'm sorry, sir," Nigel said, his voice carrying the kind of polite authority that brooked no argument, "but this establishment has a strict dress code. I'm going to have to ask you to move along." Tyson stopped, momentarily taken aback by the confrontation. He had anticipated being recognized, perhaps greeted by name, certainly not blocked from entering a venue where he was not only expected, but honored as the guest of honor. "I think there might be some confusion," Tyson said, his Morecambe accent soft but clear. "I'm here for the charity dinner. My name is Tyson Fury." Nigel's expression didn't change. In his experience, people trying to gain unauthorized access to exclusive events often claim to be someone important. The fact that this particular individual was actually telling the truth was a possibility that simply didn't occur to him. "Sir, I don't care what name you give me," Nigel replied, his tone growing more authoritative. "Look at yourself. This is one of London's finest establishments, not some sports bar or casual dining venue. You're clearly not dressed appropriately for our standards." The exchange was beginning to draw attention from other guests arriving for the dinner. A small crowd had started to gather near the entrance, their conversations pausing as they turned to observe the unusual scene unfolding before them. Cordelia Blackwood, a regular patron who served on the boards of several high-profile charities, whispered to her companion, "How presumptuous, some people simply don't understand their place." Beatrice Thornfield, a young waitress who had been arranging flowers near the entrance, felt a growing sense of unease as she watched the confrontation develop. Something about the quiet dignity of the man being turned away struck her as profoundly wrong, though she couldn't quite articulate why. Tyson pulled out his mobile phone, scrolling through his messages until he found the invitation details. "Look, I understand there's been a misunderstanding," he said, extending the phone toward Nigel. "I have the invitation right here. I'm expected at the charity dinner." Nigel barely glanced at the screen before dismissing it with a wave of his hand. "Anyone can forge a message or claim to have an invitation," he said loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "The fact remains that you're inappropriately dressed and clearly don't belong in this environment." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Tyson felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about dress codes or misunderstandings. This was about fundamental human dignity and the assumption that appearance determined worth. "I don't belong?" Tyson repeated quietly, his voice carrying a note that made several nearby guests pay closer attention. "That's correct," Nigel said, emboldened by what he perceived as support from the watching crowd. "This restaurant serves a very particular clientele. We have standards to maintain, and frankly, you don't meet them." Beatrice, who had been watching with growing distress, finally found the courage to speak up. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she addressed Nigel, "but perhaps we should verify his invitation before making any decisions." Nigel turned to her with obvious irritation. "Beatrice, I don't recall asking for your opinion on security matters. Please return to your duties." The public rebuke of the young waitress seemed to catalyze something in the crowd. What had begun as curious observation was now becoming active participation in what felt increasingly like a spectacle of social exclusion. "Quite right, Nigel," called out a man in an expensive dinner jacket. "We can't have just anyone wandering in off the street." "The audacity is really quite remarkable," added a woman draped in pearls and silk. "Some people simply don't understand boundaries." Tyson felt the familiar weight of judgment settling around him like a physical presence. Throughout his life, he had faced skepticism and prejudice based on his background, his unconventional personality, his struggles with mental health. But this was different. This was pure class-based discrimination, rendered all the more painful by its casual cruelty. "I understand your position," Tyson said to Nigel, his voice remaining calm despite the obvious humiliation of the situation. "But I'm asking you, as one human being to another, to please check your guest list or speak to your manager. I'm here to support a children's charity, not to cause any trouble." The appeal to basic humanity seemed to have the opposite effect on Nigel, who interpreted Tyson's persistence as a challenge to his authority. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one final time to leave the premises voluntarily," Nigel announced, his voice carrying clearly to every member of the gathered crowd. "If you refuse to comply, I'll be forced to call the police." The threat of police involvement sent a murmur through the assembled guests. Some looked uncomfortable with the escalation, but others seemed energized by the drama unfolding before them. It was at this moment that Reginald Pemberton, the restaurant's general manager, emerged from the building to investigate the commotion that was clearly audible from inside. Reginald was a man who prided himself on maintaining the seamless operation of high-end hospitality, and any disturbance that threatened the evening's carefully orchestrated elegance was a personal affront to his professional standards. "What seems to be the problem here?" Reginald asked, his voice carrying the kind of measured authority that came from years of managing difficult situations. "This individual is attempting to gain entry without appropriate attire," Nigel explained quickly. "He claims to have an invitation, but he's clearly not suitable for tonight's event." Reginald's gaze swept over Tyson, taking in the athletic wear, the casual appearance, the obvious mismatch between this figure and the elegantly dressed crowd surrounding them. "I see," Reginald said, his tone suggesting that he had indeed seen enough to make his judgment. "Sir, I'm sure you can understand that we have certain standards to maintain. Perhaps you might consider visiting us another time when you're more appropriately attired." The manager's support for his security guard's decision seemed to seal Tyson's fate. The crowd of onlookers, now numbering nearly 20 people, watched with a mixture of satisfaction and embarrassment as the presumptuous intruder was definitively turned away by the establishment's management. But what none of them knew, including Nigel and Reginald, was that their treatment of this unsuitable guest was about to become the most expensive mistake of their professional careers. As Tyson stood there, surrounded by the whispers and stares of people who had judged him solely on his appearance, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the crushing weight of social rejection based on nothing more than prejudice and assumption. The charity dinner that was meant to celebrate giving and compassion was beginning with an act of casual cruelty that would soon expose the hollow nature of the very values it claimed to represent. The rain continued to fall steadily on the Mayfair street as Tyson Fury found himself at the center of a growing spectacle. What had begun as a simple misunderstanding was rapidly transforming into something much more significant: a public examination of class, prejudice, and the assumptions that governed London's most exclusive social circles. More guests continued to arrive for the charity dinner, and each new arrival seemed to add to the audience for the drama unfolding at the entrance. The story was being whispered from person to person, growing in the telling. A working-class man trying to force his way into an exclusive establishment, claiming to belong among his betters, refusing to accept his place in society's hierarchy. "I really think we should reconsider this," Beatrice Thornfield said quietly to Reginald Pemberton, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. "He seems like a genuinely decent person, and he does have what appears to be a legitimate invitation." Reginald looked at her with the kind of patience typically reserved for explaining obvious truths to children. "Beatrice, I appreciate your compassion, but you're still quite new to this level of hospitality. Part of maintaining an establishment like this is understanding that not everyone who wants to be here belongs here. It's not about cruelty, it's about maintaining standards that our actual guests expect and deserve." The philosophy behind Reginald's words was shared by many in the crowd. These were people who had worked hard to achieve their positions in society, who had earned their place at exclusive tables through success, wealth, or inheritance. The idea that someone could simply walk in off the street, dressed inappropriately and making demands, challenged the very order that gave their achievements meaning. Tyson, meanwhile, had been standing quietly through this exchange, his expression growing more resigned with each passing moment. He had faced rejection before, from boxing promoters who didn't believe in his potential, from media outlets that focused on his unconventional personality rather than his achievements, from a society that often seemed more interested in tearing down than building up. But this particular form of rejection cut especially deep because it was so purely superficial, so completely disconnected from any measure of character or worth. "I want to try one more time," Tyson said to Reginald, his voice carrying a note of quiet desperation that several nearby guests found unexpectedly moving. "I'm here to support a children's charity. I've been working with disadvantaged youth for years, trying to give back to communities like the one I grew up in. This dinner is supposed to be about helping those children, and I just want to be part of that effort." The mention of his charitable work seemed to give some members of the crowd pause. After all, they were here for the same ostensible purpose, to support children in need. The irony of excluding someone based on appearance while celebrating compassion was not lost on everyone present. But Nigel Ashworth, who had built his reputation on never backing down from a decision, interpreted any hesitation in the crowd as weakness that needed to be countered with even stronger resolve. "That's a very noble story," Nigel said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "But charity work doesn't give someone the right to ignore dress codes or force their way into private events. If you really cared about helping children, you'd understand that there are proper ways to go about it." The comment drew approving nods from several guests, who seemed relieved to have their discomfort with the situation reframed as protection of proper social order rather than mere snobbery. Cordelia Blackwood, who had been observing the entire scene with growing satisfaction, decided to voice what many in the crowd were thinking. "Honestly, the presumption is remarkable," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Some people simply don't understand that wanting something doesn't mean you're entitled to it." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement from other guests, and Tyson felt the weight of collective judgment settling around him like a physical presence. These weren't just individual rejections. This was an entire social system closing ranks to protect itself from perceived intrusion. "Perhaps," suggested another guest, "he could wait outside until the event is over and speak with someone then about future opportunities to contribute to the charity." The suggestion was offered in the spirit of compromise, but its underlying message was clear. Know your place, wait your turn, accept that there are spaces where you simply don't belong. Tyson looked around at the faces surrounding him, some openly hostile, others uncomfortable, but unwilling to intervene, a few showing genuine sympathy, but lacking the courage to speak up against the crowd. In that moment, he made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the sound of the rain. "I don't belong here." The admission seemed to deflate some of the tension in the crowd, as if his acceptance of their judgment validated their behavior and allowed them to feel magnanimous in victory. "I don't belong in a place where people are judged by their clothes rather than their character," Tyson continued, his voice growing stronger. "I don't belong among people who would rather turn away someone trying to help children than risk having their evening disrupted by the wrong kind of compassion." The words hit the crowd like cold water, forcing them to confront the implications of what they had been supporting. Several guests looked genuinely uncomfortable for the first time since the confrontation had begun. "Now you're being dramatic," Reginald said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "This isn't about character, it's about respecting established protocols and understanding appropriate behavior in civilized society." "Civilized society," Tyson repeated, tasting the words as if they left a bitter flavor in his mouth. "Is that what this is?" Imogen Fairweather, who had been working at the reception desk and watching the scene through the restaurant's windows, finally worked up the courage to approach Reginald. "Sir," she said quietly, "perhaps I should check the guest list, just to be certain there hasn't been some mistake." Reginald looked annoyed at having his authority questioned by another staff member, but the suggestion was reasonable enough that refusing it would have appeared unreasonable to the watching crowd. "Very well," he said curtly, "but I'm quite certain we'll find that there's been no mistake here." As Imogen hurried inside to check the evening's reservations, an uncomfortable silence settled over the group. For the first time since the confrontation had begun, doubt began to creep into some minds. What if there had been a mistake? What if this man really was supposed to be here? But those doubts were quickly suppressed by the reassuring logic that had brought them to this point in the first place. Important people dressed appropriately for important events. Charity supporters understood proper protocols. The system worked because everyone understood their place within it. Nigel, sensing the crowd's momentary uncertainty, decided to reinforce his position with additional authority. "In my 20 years of security work," he announced, "I've developed an eye for people who belong and people who don't. This gentleman clearly falls into the latter category, regardless of what any piece of paper might say." The assertion seemed to satisfy most of the crowd, who were relieved to have their prejudices validated by professional expertise. It was at this moment that Jasper Cromwell's black Jaguar pulled up to the curb, and the owner of the Sterling Club stepped out into the rain, eager to greet his guests and ensure that his charity dinner would be the social success he had been planning for months. Jasper was a man who had built his reputation on hosting London's most exclusive events, and his restaurants had become synonymous with the kind of sophisticated philanthropy that allowed the wealthy to feel good about their privilege while maintaining all of its benefits. As he approached the entrance, adjusting his umbrella against the rain, Jasper noticed the unusual crowd gathered outside his establishment. His first thought was concern about crowd control. Too many people lingering at the entrance could create the wrong impression for arriving guests. But as he drew closer and saw the central figure of the gathering, Jasper Cromwell's face went completely white. Standing in the center of the crowd, soaked by rain and surrounded by some of London's most influential people, was Tyson Fury, the guest of honor for the evening's charity dinner, the man whose name was printed at the top of every invitation, the person whose presence was supposed to be the highlight of the entire event. The realization of what was happening hit Jasper with the force of a physical blow, and in that moment, he understood that he was witnessing the complete destruction of everything he had worked to build. The moment Jasper Cromwell recognized Tyson Fury standing among the crowd outside his restaurant, the color drained from his face so completely that several nearby guests noticed his dramatic change in appearance. The umbrella slipped from his trembling fingers as the full magnitude of the situation crashed over him like a wave. "Dear God," Jasper whispered, barely audible above the sound of the rain hitting the pavement. "What have you done?" The question was directed at no one in particular, but Nigel Ashworth, still basking in what he believed to be his professional triumph, stepped forward with confidence. "Mr. Cromwell, I've successfully prevented an unauthorized individual from disrupting tonight's event," Nigel announced proudly. "Despite his persistence and various claims, I maintained our establishment's standards and—" "You absolute fool," Jasper interrupted, his voice rising to a level that silenced every conversation in the vicinity. "Do you have any idea who this is?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and for the first time since the confrontation had begun, genuine uncertainty flickered across Nigel's face. "This is Tyson Fury," Jasper continued, his voice now carrying clearly to every member of the assembled crowd. "He is the guest of honor for tonight's charity dinner. His name is on every invitation. His photograph is in the restaurant's lobby. He is the reason we're holding this event." The silence that followed Jasper's revelation was so complete that the only sounds were the steady drumming of rain and the distant hum of London traffic. Every face in the crowd reflected the same expression of dawning horror as they realized the magnitude of their collective mistake. Cordelia Blackwood, who had been among the most vocal in her criticism of Tyson's presumption, felt her stomach drop as she recalled her earlier comments about people knowing their place. Reginald Pemberton looked as though he might be physically ill as he contemplated the professional implications of what had just occurred, but it was Nigel who bore the full weight of the revelation most heavily. 20 years of professional pride, of priding himself on his ability to distinguish between those who belonged and those who didn't, had just been destroyed in a single moment of recognition. "Mr. Fury," Jasper said, rushing toward Tyson with obvious panic. I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am for this unforgivable mistake. Please allow me to—" Tyson held up a hand, stopping Jasper's approach. The gesture was gentle but firm, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that commanded attention from everyone present. "Mr. Cromwell," Tyson said, "I appreciate your apology, but I think there's something more important we need to address here." He turned to face the crowd that had gathered to watch his humiliation, his gaze moving slowly across the faces of people who had judged him, dismissed him, and found entertainment in his rejection. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tyson began, his voice carrying clearly despite its conversational tone, "I want you to think about something. For the past 20 minutes, you've watched a man be denied entry to a charity dinner based solely on his appearance. You've seen him be treated with disrespect, had his character questioned, and been made to feel unwelcome in a place where he was supposed to be honored." The crowd shifted uncomfortably as they were forced to confront their own behavior through Tyson's words. "Now you know who I am," Tyson continued, "and suddenly my treatment seems wrong to you. But I want you to ask yourselves, was it only wrong because of who I turned out to be? Or was it wrong from the very beginning because of how you treated a fellow human being?" Beatrice Thornfield, who had tried to defend Tyson earlier, found tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized the profound truth of his words. "The man you were so eager to exclude is the same man standing before you now," Tyson said. "The only thing that's changed is your knowledge of my identity, my character, my intentions, my worthiness of basic human dignity. None of that has changed, but your perception of me has changed completely." Tyson's gaze settled on Nigel, who was standing frozen in place, his earlier confidence replaced by obvious devastation. "You told me I didn't belong here," Tyson said to Nigel, his voice gentle despite the power of his words. "You judged me by my clothes, by my appearance, by your assumptions about what kind of person deserves respect. You made me feel invisible, worthless, less than human." Nigel's hands were shaking visibly as he struggled to find words that could somehow undo what had been done. "Mr. Fury," Nigel managed to say, his voice breaking, I don't know how to begin to apologize. I was wrong, completely, utterly wrong. I let my prejudices override my humanity, and I'm ashamed of what I've done." The confession was raw and genuine, and Tyson studied Nigel's face for a long moment before responding. "Your apology means something," Tyson said finally, "but I need you to understand that this isn't really about me. I'm fortunate enough to have achieved success that protects me from the worst consequences of prejudice. But what about the people who don't have that protection? What about the good, decent human beings who get treated the way you treated me, but who don't have famous names to fall back on?" The question forced everyone present to confront the broader implications of what they had witnessed. How many people had been excluded, dismissed, or humiliated based on similar snap judgments? How many opportunities for human connection had been lost to the prejudices that seemed so reasonable until they were exposed for what they really were? "I've spent my entire career learning to read people," Nigel said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was protecting this establishment, maintaining standards, ensuring quality, but what I was really doing was enforcing prejudice. I was deciding who deserved dignity based on superficial judgments, and I was wrong." Jasper, who had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding of its significance, stepped forward to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his position, but tempered with obvious humility, "tonight was supposed to be about supporting children who society has overlooked or written off. We were meant to be celebrating the importance of giving everyone a chance, regardless of their circumstances." He paused, allowing the irony of the situation to sink in fully. "Instead, we began the evening by demonstrating exactly the kind of prejudice and exclusion that these children face every day. We proved that our commitment to compassion has limits, and those limits are drawn around our own comfort and assumptions." Reginald Pemberton, who had been silent since Jasper's revelation, finally found his voice. "Mr. Fury, on behalf of the entire staff of the Sterling Club, I want to apologize not just for the mistake, but for the cruelty. We failed not just in our professional duties, but in our basic humanity." Tyson nodded, acknowledging the apology, but his attention remained focused on the broader lesson of the evening. "The charity we're supposed to be supporting tonight works with children who are judged every day," Tyson said to the assembled crowd. "Children who are written off because of where they come from, how they dress, how they speak, what their families can afford. Tonight, you've all experienced what it feels like to participate in that kind of judgment." He looked around at the faces of people who had come to support charity, but had ended up learning about their own capacity for cruelty. "I hope you'll remember this feeling," Tyson continued, and I hope you'll think about it the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on appearances rather than character." As the crowd began to disperse, many guests approached Tyson individually to offer personal apologies. Some were perfunctory, motivated more by social obligation than genuine remorse, but others were clearly heartfelt, coming from people who had been genuinely shaken by the evening's events. Nigel Ashworth was the last to approach, and when he did, there were tears in his eyes. "Mr. Fury," he said, "I know my apology can't undo the hurt I caused you, but I want you to know that you've taught me something tonight that I should have learned long ago. I'll never forget this lesson, and I'll never treat another person the way I treated you." Tyson extended his hand to Nigel, and when the security guard took it, the handshake lasted longer than protocol required. "Everyone deserves dignity," Tyson said simply. "Rich or poor, famous or unknown, well-dressed or casual, everyone deserves to be treated as if they matter. That's not just good manners, it's basic humanity." As the guests finally moved inside for the charity dinner, Beatrice Thornfield approached Tyson with obvious nervousness. "Mr. Fury," she said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for handling that situation with such grace. Many people would have responded with anger, but you turned it into a teaching moment. That took real strength." Tyson smiled at the young waitress who had been the only person to defend him when he needed it most. "Sometimes the most important victories aren't won with fists," he replied. "Sometimes they're won by helping people see themselves more clearly and choose to be better." The charity dinner that followed raised more money than any previous event in the Sterling Club's history. But the real success of the evening wasn't measured in pounds donated. It was measured in the number of people who left with a deeper understanding of their own prejudices and a commitment to treating others with greater dignity and respect. And in the months that followed, Nigel Ashworth became known throughout London's hospitality industry as a security professional who treated every person who approached his establishments with courtesy and respect, regardless of their appearance or apparent status. Sometimes the most profound changes come not from grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but from moments of human recognition that force us to see ourselves as we really are and choose to become something better.